For this tutorial, you may need your puppet, fabric, sewing pins, Velcro or other fastener, fabric glue or hot glue, scissors, wide ribbon, and thin ribbon. I like to remove the head and open the arms wide because I think it's easier to work with this way, but don't worry if you've already glued your head on. I'll show you later how to make openings in your costume to fit over your puppet's head. I'm going to start with a simple tank top and skirt. I use a wide ribbon because it's basically already the right size. Wrapping it around the torso allows me to figure out what length I need. I'm careful to overlap by about 1/4 of an inch so that I have something to attach a fastener to. Now I'll use the thin ribbon to create the straps. Again, I'm careful to make sure I've got about 1/4 of an inch overlap so that I've got room to attach the thin ribbon to the thick ribbon. I'll use the strap I already cut to measure for the second one. Now I'll do a test fit with all the ribbons to make sure everything looks right before I adhere them together. Once I decide it's good to go, I'll use my fingers to pin the ribbons in place. I might do a little bit of straightening, but I'm really not going to move them out of where I had them. Then use just a tiny dab of glue. You really don't need much to adhere them. I use a hot glue gun throughout my tutorial because it's faster and easier for me, but if you want to use fabric glue, it does take longer to dry, which can be a good thing because it gives you time to reposition your objects, but you'll also need to use sewing pins to hold everything in place while it dries. And of course, you use the same process for the second strap as you did for the first. I'm constantly measuring my costumes up against my puppet to make sure that I always stay on track. I'm not going to glue the straps in the back. I'll just use tension to hold them in place. This way I can always put them on my puppet easier whether I have the head on or off. At this point, I need to decide what I'm going to fasten it with in the back. I can use Velcro or ribbon. Either one will work just fine. It depends on your personal preference and the look that you're going for. I ended up using Velcro in most of these situations, but you will see a few where I used ribbon instead. I only needed about 1/8 of an inch piece, which is a pretty tiny little sliver, but since I have just a 1/4 inch overlap, I thought that was a pretty decent size. At this point, I really just wanted to test out the adhesion from the manufacturer that the Velcro had. It turned out not to be enough, and I used the glue gun to glue it in place. All right, let's get the skirt taken care of. I'll measure the skirt around the waist to make sure it fits, but I want to make sure I give myself plenty of extra as well because I want my skirt to be a little bit poofy, which means I'm going to need to pleat it. I also measure it to make sure it's the length that I want. I'm going for about knee length on this one. To give myself a cleaner edge to work with, I'm folding the top over and then I use my scissors to give it a nice little crease so that I can fold it back in place after I've glued it. This is one instance where I'll use a ribbon to fasten the skirt in place. I'm going to measure it around the waist and then make sure that I give myself plenty of extra so that I can tie a bow onto it. I also need to figure out just how tight I want it to be around the waist, so I measure that and then mark it with my markers so I know where the skirt should start and end. Then I straighten my ribbon out, note where my first mark begins, and that's where I'm going to start gluing my skirt to. I do a very simple pleat where I glue down about 1/2 inch of fabric and then I glue it backwards on itself for maybe about 1/8 of an inch, glue it forward 1/2 inch, glue it backwards about 1/8 of an inch, glue it forward 1/2 inch, backwards 1/8 of an inch, and so on. You could do this more precisely with a ruler, but I just kind of feel it out. Notice how my fabric goes about 1/4 of an inch past the mark on my ribbon. This will allow it to overlap and I'll be able to create a seam instead of having to worry about my skirt constantly opening in the back. In order to create my seam, I lay my skirt face up and then I put a little bead of glue on it and then I fold it over on itself so that it's inside out and compress it over the glue. This way when I turn it right side out, the seam is facing inward and looks neater. Now I tie the bow for my last fitting. Check out the other costume tutorials to see how I created the rest of the pieces.